They say every story begins with a choice, but mine began with a shiver. That night, the wind cut through my bones like knives, and I clung to my only blanket as if my life depended on it. I had no idea that within minutes I'd face a decision that would rip warmth from my own body, test the limits of my compassion, and tie my fate to a stranger who seemed worthless to the world. A stranger who would one day reveal himself as the man who owned everything around me. The night was merciless, the kind of night when the stars seemed to hide, when even the moon refused to shine, leaving the village wrapped in shadows. The air carried a biting chill, unusual for our part of Africa, where heat ruled the days, but cold owned the nights. My breath came out in small white clouds as I trudged home along the dusty roadside, my arms wrapped tightly around the only possession that mattered, my blanket. It wasn't new, it wasn't soft, but it was mine. A patchwork of old Ankara cloth stitched carefully by my late mother's tired hands. Every square of fabric carried history, a faded piece from her favorite dress, a shirt my father once wore before he vanished, scraps gifted by neighbors when we had nothing. It smelled faintly of smoke from our kitchen fire, and whenever I wrapped it around me, it felt like her arms still held me, protecting me from the world's cruelty. That night, survival meant holding on to it. I was already trembling, my stomach empty after a long day of labor, my body begging for rest. The blanket was my shield against hunger, against cold, against despair. Without it, I felt I would break. And then, I saw him. At first, he was just a shadow by the roadside, hunched against the broken frame of an abandoned wooden shelter. But as I drew closer, the darkness revealed him. An old man, frail and trembling, his clothes nothing but rags clinging to his thin frame. His skin looked pale under the dim starlight, his lips cracked, his hands shaking violently as he tried to shield himself from the merciless wind. He was shivering so hard I thought his bones might break. His chest rose and fell with shallow, desperate breaths. He looked less like a man and more like a forgotten relic, discarded, ignored, invisible. I froze mid-step. A war began inside me. "Keep walking," one voice whispered. "You can't save everyone. If you give him your blanket, you'll freeze tonight. You'll suffer tomorrow. Think of your siblings. Think of yourself." But another voice rose louder, stronger, echoing words my mother had once whispered to me on nights just like this. "Kindness is never wasted, my son. Even if the world forgets, God remembers." I stood there, staring at him. My hands gripped the blanket tighter, as if my body already knew what my heart was about to do. Then his eyes lifted. And in that single glance, everything inside me shattered. They weren't the eyes of a beggar. They weren't the eyes of a man resigned to death. They were weary, yes, sunken with hunger and pain, but they carried something else. A spark, a dignity long buried beneath suffering, a silent plea that wasn't for pity, but for mercy. My chest tightened. I felt the cold sting my skin as if mocking me. I needed the blanket. Yet I knew he needed it more. My hands trembled as I pulled it from my shoulders. The moment the cold air touched my body, I gasped, teeth clattering. But I didn't stop. Step by step, I walked toward him, kneeling slowly by his side. His eyes widened slightly, disbelief flickering across his face. "Here," I whispered, my voice breaking. I draped the blanket over him gently. For a moment he resisted, shaking his head weakly, but then his frail hands clutched it, pulling it close to his chest like treasure. His shivering slowed, his breathing steadied, and his eyes, those deep, heavy eyes, filled with tears. "Why?" he croaked, his voice cracked and hollow. "Why would you do this?" I opened my mouth, but no words came. What could I say? That my mother's teachings had left scars of kindness I couldn't ignore? That his suffering had struck me deeper than my own? That I feared if I walked away, I would lose more than just my blanket. I would lose myself. so I simply nodded. His lips trembled, but this time it wasn't from cold. It was from emotion. He gripped the blanket tightly, as if afraid I would take it back. "Thank you," he whispered. But his eyes said more than words ever could. They held depth, recognition, something I couldn't explain. It was as though he was measuring me, as though my act had revealed something to him that I didn't yet understand. I stood slowly, hugging myself against the bitter cold. Every step I took away from him was heavier than the last. My body screamed in protest, shivering violently without its shield, but my heart felt strangely lighter. By the time I reached home, my lips were blue, my hands numb, my body aching. I curled up on the floor mat, teeth chattering, whispering prayers that morning would come quickly. I missed the blanket desperately, missed its warmth, its smell of smoke and home. But one thought burned in my mind, refusing to fade. His eyes. Why did they haunt me? Why did they feel familiar? And why, when he said, "Thank you," did it sound less like gratitude and more like a promise? I thought it was over that night. Just a moment of mercy in a life filled with struggle. I thought I'd given away a piece of myself to a man I'd never see again. But fate doesn't waste moments like that. Little did I know, the old man wrapped in my blanket would return, and when he did, nothing in my life would ever be the same again. People think kindness is easy, but when you're poor, it costs more than anyone can imagine. Sometimes giving isn't about generosity. It's about bleeding quietly while the world looks away. The night I gave away my blanket was only one chapter in a book of struggles that defined my life. For as long as I could remember, every sunrise in our small African village brought with it a new battle. Poverty wasn't just an occasional visitor. It lived with us, sat at our table, and followed us everywhere, like a shadow we could never escape. Each morning, I woke before dawn to fetch water from a stream 2 miles away. My younger siblings, still too small to understand responsibility, often slept curled together on the mat we all shared. I watched them breathe softly, their stomachs empty, their bodies fragile, and every time I looked at them, I felt the crushing weight of being both brother and father. My mother's illness made it worse. She had once been strong, the kind of woman who could carry baskets of cassava on her head while humming songs of hope. But sickness had stolen her strength, leaving her coughing violently through the night, her body shrinking before my eyes. Medicine was expensive, and every coin I earned slipped too quickly from my hands into the pharmacist's palm. That's why the blanket mattered so much. It wasn't just a piece of cloth. It was warmth on nights when the cold seeped into our bones. It was comfort for my mother when the fever made her shiver. And more than that, it was her last gift to me. The final thing she had sewn with her own hands before her illness took over. Letting it go that night felt like letting go of her. But how could I have walked past him? How could I have kept her gift when another life was crumbling right before my eyes? The next morning, the consequences came. My siblings huddled close to me, their small bodies trembling in the chill. My mother's eyes lingered on me when she noticed the blanket was gone. She didn't scold me. She just sighed softly, as though she knew why I had done it. That silence hurt more than any harsh word could have. But the villagers weren't silent. They laughed. They mocked. Some shook their heads as if I were a fool. "You gave away your mother's blanket to a beggar?" one man sneered at the market. "Kindness doesn't fill stomachs," another woman muttered. "You'll regret helping a useless old man. They only take and take." Their words stung. It wasn't that I expected praise, but the ridicule cut deeper than I was prepared for. They made me feel stupid, naive, weak. That night, I curled up on the mat with nothing to cover me, the cold creeping into my bones, and their voices echoed in my mind. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget his face, his trembling hands, his tear-filled eyes, the way he had clutched the blanket as if I had handed him the entire world. Days passed, and life carried on with its cruel rhythm. I worked odd jobs at the printing shop, carrying ink-stained papers until my hands were black with smudges. I ran errands for wealthier families who barely noticed my presence. Sometimes I carried loads at the marketplace until my back ached. Every coin counted. Every small job was survival. Yet at night, when silence wrapped the village, I lay awake staring at the roof, haunted by his image. The way he had looked at me. It wasn't the look of a man forgotten. It was the look of someone who saw me. And that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I tried to convince myself he was gone. Maybe he had moved on to another village. Maybe he hadn't survived the cold. Maybe I had given away the last piece of my mother's love for nothing. But then came the whispers. A child at the market claimed to have seen him near the river. A woman fetching firewood swore he was sitting under the baobab tree, staring into the horizon. Some said he was crazy. Others said he was harmless. But everyone agreed on one thing. He didn't belong. Neither did I, it seemed. The more they mocked me for my act of kindness, the more isolated I felt. I didn't belong with the villagers who only looked after themselves, who saw compassion as weakness. Yet I also didn't belong with him, the mysterious stranger whose silence carried secrets I couldn't begin to understand. Still, my heart refused to let go, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw him shivering, wrapped in the only warmth I could give. I tried to bury the memory, to focus on survival. My mother's cough grew worse, my siblings grew hungrier, and work became harder. Kindness, I told myself, was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. Survival demanded selfishness. Survival demanded strength. But fate has a way of laughing at such decisions. One afternoon, as the sun beat down on the dusty streets, I carried a sack of maize through the crowded market. Sweat stung my eyes, vendors shouted prices, and the smell of roasted groundnuts hung in the air. I was exhausted, lost in the rhythm of survival. And then, I felt it. A presence. Someone was watching me. I turned, wiping the sweat from my forehead. And there he was, the old man, standing at the edge of the market, half hidden in the shadows of a mango tree. His clothes were still torn, his figure still frail, but his eyes, they were fixed on me, not with gratitude, not with desperation, but with something far heavier, something that made my stomach twist. My breath caught in my chest. He wasn't gone. He wasn't forgotten. He was right there, watching me with an intensity that made my heart race. The villagers had said he was useless, a nobody, but as his eyes locked onto mine, I realized the truth. This man was far more than he appeared, and for reasons I couldn't yet grasp, he had come back for me. When I saw him again, I knew he wasn't just another homeless man. There was something in his eyes, something in the way he carried himself, that whispered of a past far bigger than the rags he wore. For days after giving him my blanket, I lived caught between guilt and doubt. I wondered if he had survived the night. Sometimes, when the cold crept into my bones, I regretted letting go of my only shield. Other times, when my mother coughed weakly in the darkness, I told myself I had been reckless. But then, I saw him again. It was a busy afternoon in the marketplace. Vendors shouted their prices, the air smelled of roasted maize, and children chased each other barefoot through the crowd. I was carrying a basket of cassava when my eyes wandered to the far corner near the old mango tree. There he was. The old man sat on the edge of a wooden bench, his back slightly bent, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His clothes were still ragged, his hair matted, but he didn't look like the desperate beggar I remembered from that freezing night. He wasn't begging. He wasn't reaching out for pity. He was simply watching. His gaze moved slowly across the market, studying people as if he were reading them like books. The shopkeepers, the customers, the gossiping women, the playful children. He observed them all with an intensity that unsettled me. He looked less like a man forgotten by life and more like a man measuring it. I stopped in my tracks. For a moment, the world around me blurred. My heart thudded against my ribs. I couldn't explain it, but I felt drawn to him. I set the basket down and walked toward him. He didn't look at me until I was standing right in front of him, and when he did, his eyes pierced through me the same way they had that night, the same strange mix of sorrow and strength. "You survived," I said awkwardly, my voice cracking more than I intended. He gave a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "So did you." I frowned, unsure what he meant. For a while, silence stretched between us. The noise of the marketplace swirled around us, but somehow it felt like we were in our own world, a bubble of quiet no one else could enter. I noticed the way he sat, upright, calm, dignified. Beggars usually hunched, pleaded, or fidgeted. Not him. He carried himself like someone used to being seen, used to being heard, used to command. And yet here he was, in rags, ignored by everyone but me. "You must be hungry," I blurted out, breaking the silence. I reached into my small bag and pulled out a piece of roasted yam wrapped in brown paper. It wasn't much, just a portion I had saved for later, but it was all I had. He looked at it, then at me. At first he shook his head. "Keep it. You need it more than I do." His refusal surprised me. Most beggars would snatch food without hesitation, but he spoke with quiet dignity, almost as if accepting it would shame him. "Please," I insisted, pushing it gently toward him. "If I didn't want you to have it, I wouldn't offer it." For a moment he studied me, his eyes narrowing as though testing my sincerity. Then, slowly, he reached out and accepted it. But even then, he didn't eat immediately. He bowed his head slightly, as though offering a silent prayer, before breaking off a small piece and chewing it slowly. Watching him unsettled me even more. His mannerisms weren't those of a man broken by poverty. They were deliberate, composed, like habits formed in another life, another world. Finally, he looked up at me. "Why did you give me your blanket that night?" The question caught me off guard. I blinked, my throat tightening. "Because you needed it more than I did," I answered weakly. He tilted his head, his gaze deepening. "People walked past me. They all saw me. Some even laughed. You were the only one who stopped." "Why?" I shifted uncomfortably, my palms sweaty. "I don't know. I just couldn't ignore you." A silence hung heavy between us. His eyes searched mine as though he was trying to peel away every layer to see the truth behind my words. Then his voice dropped lower, softer, carrying a weight that sent a chill down my spine. "You remind me," he whispered, "of someone I once lost." His words struck me like a hammer. Someone he once lost? Who was he talking about? Why me? My heart pounded as his eyes locked onto mine, filled with a strange recognition I couldn't understand. He wasn't just a homeless man. He was something else. Someone else. And my life was about to be entangled with his in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The more I spoke with him, the more his mystery grew. He was no ordinary beggar. His words carried the weight of secrets I could not explain. Every question he asked felt like a mirror held to my soul, forcing me to face truths I had long buried. Something deep inside told me this meeting was not random. It was destiny, and destiny never arrives without a price. I remember sitting across from him that evening, the air heavy with dust and the cries of distant children echoing in the village lanes. He sat on the ground, his clothes torn and faded, his beard wild and unkempt. To anyone else, he looked like a broken man, a soul crushed by life. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw something else. His gaze was sharp, steady, piercing through me as though he could read the thoughts I tried to hide. He didn't waste time on greetings. He asked me questions no stranger should dare to ask, questions that cut deeper than any wound. "What do you dream of when no one is watching?" he asked softly, his voice carrying a weight that made my heart pound. I hesitated, unsure whether to answer, unsure why a beggar cared about the dreams of someone like me. But before I could reply, he pressed further. "What hurts you the most at night? Is it hunger, debt, or something deeper?" I froze. Who was this man to ask such things? How could he know the battles I carried in silence? When I spoke of my father's illness, of the debts that chained us to misery, I saw his eyes flicker. It wasn't pity. It was recognition, as though he had lived through the same agony once before. For a moment, I felt he wasn't listening to me describe my pain. He was listening to his own story told in my voice. Then his questions shifted. No longer about me alone. Why is the school still broken? Why do the children sit under leaking roofs? Why do women walk miles for water when the wells in this village once overflowed? Why do your leaders feed on your hunger? My breath caught. He spoke of things only we villagers knew, struggles we carried every day. How could a man in rags, who lived outside our homes and our lives, know every detail of our suffering? His voice wasn't filled with curiosity. It carried the authority of someone who had studied us, watched us, and understood us far better than we understood ourselves. Whispers soon spread. Villagers warned me to stay away from him. Some called him cursed. Others whispered he had lost his mind after a tragedy long ago. An old woman even clutched my arm one night, her voice trembling. Do not listen too closely, child. His words are snares. They will bind your spirit if you let them in. But I couldn't stay away. The more they warned me, the stronger the pull became. Something about him felt dangerous, yes, but not in the way they meant. He wasn't dangerous because he was mad. He was dangerous because he knew too much, because he saw too much. And deep down, I feared he saw something in me that I had not yet discovered myself. The following evening, I gathered the courage to confront him. My heart raced as I sat in front of him again. Who are you really? I asked, my voice firmer this time. He smiled faintly, his lips curling as if I had just asked the only question that mattered. But instead of answering, he leaned forward and whispered a question of his own. If you could change one thing in this village, just one, what would it be? I was stunned. Of all the things he could have said, this was not what I expected. His eyes locked on mine, unblinking, waiting. I tried to push the question away, but it wouldn't leave me. For the first time, I thought not of my own suffering, but of the pain we all shared. Images rushed through my mind. Children sitting in a broken school, their books ruined by rain. Mothers carrying pots on their heads, walking miles under the burning sun. Fathers breaking their backs in the fields only to return home with empty hands. My throat tightened. I swallowed hard before answering. I would rebuild the school, so the children don't lose hope, so they can grow up believing life can be more than just hunger and struggle. The smile faded from his face. His eyes grew sharper, colder, as if he were dissecting my soul. For a long moment, he said nothing, only studied me. Finally, in a low whisper, he said, "Good. That is the answer I hoped for." A chill ran through me. Why did my answer matter to him? What game was he playing? It felt as if I had unknowingly stepped into a test, one I hadn't prepared for. My chest tightened with unease. Who was this man that he could make me feel like a child standing before a judge? That night, I lay awake, his words echoing in my mind. The way he had stared at me, the weight in his voice when he spoke. It haunted me. He hadn't simply asked a question. He had measured me, tested me, and I had no idea what the consequences of passing, or failing, that test would be. His silence lingered longer than his words, and in that silence, I felt the ground beneath me shift. He wasn't a beggar, nor a madman. He was something else, something far more dangerous. The villager's warnings echoed in my mind, but his gaze had carved itself into my soul. Something in his eyes told me he wasn't mad. He was testing me, and the real trial had only just begun. Our quiet village shook the day. Black cars rolled through our dusty roads. Engines roared where silence had always lived, and dust rose like smoke as if announcing a storm. We had never seen such power on wheels, never witnessed wealth invading our poverty so boldly. Everyone froze, breathless, Because we knew. When cars like that arrive, they do not come empty of purpose. The morning had started like any other. Children chasing goats, women filling pots from the faraway stream, and old men gathered under the neem tree sharing bitter stories of life. But everything changed when we heard it. The low growl of engines, deep and heavy, echoing through our narrow lanes. At first we thought it was a mistake. Cars like that did not belong here. Our roads were meant for bullock carts and bicycles, not shining monsters with tinted windows and chrome teeth. One by one, the villagers rushed out of their huts, their eyes wide, their mouths half open in disbelief. Black SUVs rolled through the dust like beasts claiming new territory. Their tires spat dirt, their windows reflected the sun like armor. And then we saw them. Men in dark suits stepping out, their shoes untouched by dust, their eyes hidden behind black glasses. Their presence was so sharp, so out of place, it felt like the very air around them turned colder. Whispers spread like wildfire. Government officials, some said. Police raid, others guessed. A few muttered that perhaps the land was being taken away, that the village was about to be erased. Fear and curiosity tangled inside us, drawing us closer, yet keeping us trembling. Children clung to their mothers, and even the elders stood quietly, their wisdom failing against such mystery. I stood among them, heart racing, trying to understand what could bring such men here. That's when my eyes found him, the beggar, the man everyone warned me about. He stood at the edge of the crowd, calm, still, his gaze fixed on the cars as if he had been waiting for this very moment. While the rest of us gasped and whispered, he did not flinch. There was no fear in his eyes. There was recognition. A shiver ran down my spine. Could it be possible? Were they here? For him? The men in suits did not glance at us. They did not care for our curiosity or our whispers. They scanned the area with sharp precision, their hands always near their belts, as if ready for trouble. Villagers bowed their heads, moving back in fear, unsure of whether to greet them or hide. One man, braver than the rest, asked loudly, "Who are you looking for?" No answer came. Silence, heavier than words, hung in the air. I looked again at the beggar. He hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. His ragged clothes fluttered slightly in the wind, yet his posture was straighter than I had ever seen it. It was then I realized. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't confused. He was prepared. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some still believed the men had come for land inspection or political work. Others whispered darker theories. Maybe a criminal was hiding among us. Maybe war was coming. But none of us dared to step closer. The gap between their polished shoes and our cracked earth felt wider than any ocean. And then it happened. One of the suited men spoke into his earpiece, nodded once, and turned, not toward the village head, not toward the elders, not toward the strongest man in the crowd. His eyes fixed directly on the beggar in the shadows. Slowly, as if rehearsed, all of them began to walk. Step by step, they cut through the dust, their suits untouched, their boots heavy, and the crowd parted like frightened cattle, creating a clear path between the powerful and the forgotten. Gasps filled the air. "No! Impossible!" someone cried. "Why him?" another shouted. Mothers pulled their children back, as if the man they had called mad all these years had suddenly transformed into something dangerous. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it would break my ribs. Every warning the villagers had given me about him crashed into my mind. Every strange question he had asked me suddenly burned with new meaning. The pieces didn't fit, yet I knew deep inside he was not who we thought he was. The beggar did not move away. He did not run. Instead, he took one small step forward, his chin lifting ever so slightly, his ragged body transforming in that moment into something else entirely. For the first time, he looked less like a beggar and more like a man returning to his throne. The men in suits stopped just a few feet away from him. The crowd held its breath, waiting, watching, unable to look away. I felt as though I was standing at the edge of a secret too big for our little village, a truth that had hidden itself in rags all along. And then, the impossible unfolded before our eyes. The men in suits did not question him, did not dismiss him. They bowed their heads ever so slightly, a gesture of respect no one in our village had ever received. The crowd trembled in disbelief, but my blood froze in my veins. The men had not come for us, for land, or for politics. They had come for him, and the moment they walked straight toward him, I knew nothing in our world would ever be the same again. The man I thought was a beggar stood taller than kings that day. His rags no longer made him small. His presence swallowed the ground beneath him. The men in suits, the black cars, the entire village, all of it bent around him like he was the center of gravity. In that moment, I realized we had never truly seen him. We had only seen the mask he chose to wear. The air was thick with disbelief. We stood frozen, villagers pressed shoulder to shoulder, our breaths locked in our throats. The dust from the cars still lingered in the sunlight, yet no one noticed it anymore. All eyes were fixed on him. The beggar, the man we had mocked, pitied, and avoided. He dusted off his ragged coat with a calmness that felt unnatural, almost royal. The movement was small, but it was enough to change everything. For years we had seen him as nothing, but in that moment, he looked untouchable. And then the impossible happened. The men in suits bowed slightly, not out of courtesy, but out of respect. A ripple went through the crowd. Gasps, cries, whispers. Our minds refused to believe what our eyes were witnessing. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Elders shook their heads in silent denial. And I could not move at all. And then he spoke. His voice, once soft and weary, now rang with authority that silenced the earth itself. "My name," he said slowly, letting the weight of every word fall heavy on us, "is Kofi Mensa. I am the one who built this village." The words struck like thunder. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. How could this man, clothed in rags, claim to have built everything around us? But the men in suits didn't question him. They didn't laugh. They stood tall behind him like loyal guardians, confirming his every word with their silence. The villagers erupted. Some shouted in disbelief, others crossed themselves as if warding off a spirit. A few even tried to run, but their feet stumbled in the dirt. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Could it be true? Could the man we had scorned all this time be the very hand that created our home? He turned, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. They were not the eyes of a madman. They were the eyes of a man who had carried power, loss, and secrets for longer than any of us had lived. "You walk on the soil I laid," he continued. "You drink from the wells I dug. The school you abandoned, the roads you cursed, they were my gift. And when I disappeared, you forgot me. You replaced my name with stories of madness. You buried me before I was dead." The weight of shame pressed on us. No one dared speak. Our silence was an admission of guilt. But then, his eyes fell on me. "And you," he said, pointing directly at me, his voice sharp as a blade, "are the one I've been searching for." The world blurred. My knees weakened. My breath caught in my chest. Every face in the crowd turned toward me, eyes wide, mouths open. Why me? I was no leader, no hero. I was just another soul chained by poverty. Yet his words carried no hesitation. He knew me. He had been waiting for me. My heart raced. I tried to speak, to protest, but my lips trembled. He had asked me questions before. Questions about dreams, about change, about what I would rebuild. Had that been the test? Had my answer sealed my fate? He stepped closer, and I could feel the air tighten. "You carry what others have lost," he said, his tone both commanding and gentle. "You dared to dream when the rest accepted chains. That is why I chose you." A storm raged inside me. Part of me wanted to run, to disappear into the crowd, to deny everything. Another part of me burned with a strange fire, a pull I couldn't explain. His words were terrifying, but they awakened something inside me, something I didn't know had been waiting. The villagers whispered furiously. Some accused me of being cursed. Others shouted that I was in league with him. Fear twisted their voices, but I barely heard them. My world had narrowed to the man before me, to the truth unraveling in his eyes. He raised his hand, silencing the crowd once more. I did not return for land, or wealth, or power. I returned for hope. And that hope, whether you believe it or not, rests in this young one. His finger still pointed at me, and every eye followed. My chest tightened, sweat beading on my skin. I wanted to scream, to deny it all, but the words refused to leave. Deep inside, a terrifying thought echoed. What if he's right? What if this is my destiny? The sun began to set, its golden light casting long shadows over the village. The black cars gleamed like predators waiting for command. The men in suits stood still, disciplined, their presence undeniable proof of his power. Kofi Mensah turned back to the crowd, his voice rising one final time. "You see a beggar, but I chose this disguise. I needed to know whether the spirit of this village still breathed. I needed to know if someone among you could still see beyond hunger and despair. And now I know." His words wrapped around me like chains and wings all at once. Chains, because I knew life as I had lived it was over. Wings, because for the first time, I felt as though the world expected more from me than just survival. The villagers stared, caught between worship and fear. Mothers whispered prayers, children hid behind their fathers, and the elders bowed their heads in silence. The truth had been revealed, but it was a truth too big for us to carry. And then, he turned to me once more, his eyes locked onto mine, burning, relentless. "Your time begins now," he said. My chest heaved, my mind spinning as though the earth itself had tilted beneath me. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my village, even myself, shattered in an instant. His words were a crown and a curse placed upon my head, a destiny I hadn't chosen. In that moment, my entire world tilted on its axis. Why would a billionaire disguise himself as a beggar? His reason shook me. The same man we had thrown scraps of food to, the man we mocked in whispers, now stood before us as the master of everything we called home. And when he revealed why he chose rags over riches, my heart ached in ways I never thought possible. The villagers still murmured in shock, their disbelief filling the air like smoke after a fire. Kofi Mensah's name spread from mouth to mouth, carried on trembling lips, as though speaking it aloud would make it less impossible. But for me, the weight of his gaze was heavier than the crowd's noise. He had pointed at me, chosen me, and now he began to tell his story, not just to the village, but to me. He stepped forward, his shadow long in the fading sun, and his voice fell like thunder, yet carried the softness of pain. "I once had everything," he began. "Wealth beyond measure, land stretching farther than eyes could see, and a family that I thought loved me. But wealth builds walls around the heart. It blinds those closest to you." The men in suits bowed their heads slightly, as though they too knew the truth of his pain. The villagers leaned in closer, spellbound by the confession unraveling before them. "My own blood betrayed me," he continued. "Brothers who smiled at my table plotted to steal it all. Relatives who laughed in my home sharpened knives for my backs. The empire I built with my sweat became their battlefield, and in their greed, they forgot the very soil from which we rose." A hush swept over us. The bitterness in his voice was not anger. It was sorrow, the sorrow of a man who had been wounded by the very people he trusted most. "So I left," he said simply. "I left behind the palaces, the businesses, the endless chase for power. I returned here, to the roots of my life, where I first planted hope. But I could not return as myself. I had to see the truth. I had to test the hearts of the people. My breath caught. Suddenly, every moment with him made sense. The strange questions, the piercing gaze, the way he seemed to know us better than we knew ourselves. He had not been watching us as a beggar. He had been judging us as a father returning to his children. He looked at me then, his eyes softer than before. The world bows to gold, but gold cannot buy what I sought. I needed to find someone who could not be bought, someone who would give, even when they had little. And then, in front of everyone, he said the words that made my heart stop. "The night you gave me your blanket, child, you gave me more than warmth. You gave me proof that compassion still lived in this village, proof that wealth had not killed every last seed of kindness." My cheeks burned. I remembered that night clearly, the night I saw him shivering in the cold and gave him the only blanket I had. I hadn't thought much of it. To me, it was simple humanity, but to him, it had been a test. Around me, villagers lowered their heads in shame. For years they had walked past him, ignored him, mocked him, and now they saw what their cruelty meant. They had turned away from the very man who had given them water, shelter, and life. A heavy silence fell, filled with regret. Some of the elders even wept openly, their pride shattered. Children clung to their mothers, confused, sensing the weight of the moment, but not understanding its history. Kofi's voice softened further, carrying the ache of loneliness. "Do you know what it means to have the world, yet feel utterly alone? To have thousands at your command, but not a single soul you can trust? I wore rags not because I had fallen, but because I wanted to rise differently. I wanted to see who among you still carried light in their hearts." My chest tightened. His loneliness seeped into me, his sorrow a mirror of my own hidden fears. For the first time, I didn't see a billionaire or a beggar. I saw a man, wounded, searching, desperate to believe love still existed in the world. The villagers shifted uneasily. Some muttered apologies under their breath, though they knew it was too late. Their shame hung in the air like chains, but his eyes never lingered on them for long. His gaze always returned to me. "You," he said, his voice steady, "proved what no amount of money could prove. You cannot buy compassion. You cannot purchase love. And in you I saw what I needed most, the heart of the future." My lips trembled. His words felt too heavy, too dangerous. The villagers stared at me now with a mix of awe and envy, their whispers turning into murmurs I could no longer ignore. My life, my simple life of debts and struggles, was being rewritten in front of their eyes. He took a step closer. My pulse thundered. His shadow fell over me, not threatening but unshakable, as though destiny itself leaned in to claim me. Then his words came, words that shook me more than any truth he had revealed before. He looked into my eyes, with a calm that terrified me. The crowd fell silent, waiting, their breaths caught in the net of his power. And then, in a voice that carried both command and plea, he asked me the question I feared most. "Will you walk with me as my heir?" In that instant, my blood turned cold, for his question was not an invitation. It was a crossroads that could change my life forever. Why would a billionaire disguise himself as a beggar? His reason shook me. The same man we had thrown scraps of food to, the man we mocked in whispers, now stood before us as the master of everything we called home. And when he revealed why he chose rags over riches, my heart ached in ways I never thought possible. The moment hung heavy, as though time itself had frozen to listen. The villagers shifted uncomfortably, their shame painted across their faces. Kofi Mensah, no longer the beggar we had ignored, stood tall, the sun behind him casting a crown of light over his ragged head. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of storms. I had everything a man could dream of, he began. Wealth, land, and a family whose love I thought was true. But gold is a poison. It blinds the eyes and corrupts the heart. My own blood betrayed me. Brothers plotted, cousins schemed, and soon my empire was not a home, but a battlefield. His words tore through the crowd. Betrayal was something every villager understood, but to hear it from a man who once held the world in his palm made it feel like a wound cut into all of us. I left it all behind, he continued, his eyes scanning the people who once called him mad. I walked away from the palaces, the noise, the endless fight for power. I came back to the soil where my journey began, but I could not return as myself, not as Kofi Mensah, the builder. I had to return as nothing. I had to see who among you still carried hearts untouched by greed. I felt the words pierce me. Suddenly, his strange questions, his quiet watching, all of it made sense. He had been testing us, measuring our souls against the weight of truth. He turned to me, his gaze steady, unflinching. And then came that night, he said, his voice lowering. The night you saw me shivering in the cold and gave me your only blanket. That moment proved what no treasure could. Compassion cannot be bought. And in you, I found the proof I had been searching for. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My cheeks burned, and my heart thudded painfully in my chest. That small act, the one I had forgotten, was now the reason every eye in the village was fixed on me. Mothers clutched their children tighter, men lowered their heads, and the elders closed their eyes in shame. For years they had walked past him. For years they had pretended not to see. And now the truth exposed them all. Kofi's voice softened, and for a moment I saw not a king, not a billionaire, but a lonely man, stripped bare. Do you know what it means to be surrounded by thousands, yet trust no one? To sleep in beds of silk and still shiver from the cold of betrayal? I wore these rags not because I had fallen, but because I wanted to rise again, differently. I wanted to see who among my people still had a heart worth saving. The weight of his loneliness pressed on me, heavier than his power. His pain was not just his, it was ours too. For the first time, I understood him not as a beggar or a ruler, but as a man who had been abandoned by the very love he trusted. The villagers wept quietly, their shame undeniable. But his eyes never lingered on them long. They always returned to me. You showed me kindness when the world showed me scorn, he said, his voice steady now, strong. And for that, you are the one I choose. The world tilted. Whispers rose around me, some in awe, some in jealousy, some in fear. My knees felt weak, my lips dry, my heart caught in my throat. Chosen? Me. I was no leader, no hero, just a villager burdened with debts and dreams too heavy for my shoulders. But before I could think, before I could breathe, his words cut through the noise, sharper than any blade. He stepped closer, his eyes burning into mine, his voice carrying both command and plea. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the impossible words that followed. And then he asked me the question I feared most. Will you walk with me as my heir? My blood froze, for I knew his question was not a choice. It was a destiny that could either save me or destroy me. Not everyone was happy that he chose me. In fact, most wanted me destroyed. The day he named me his heir, I felt the ground shift beneath me, not from pride, but from the hatred it stirred. Smiles turned to daggers, whispers turned to storms, and I realized quickly, destiny does not crown you without drawing enemies to your feet. At first, I thought the hardest part was accepting his offer, stepping into a destiny I never asked for. But I soon learned the truth. The hardest part was surviving the envy it awakened. The moment Kofi Mensah declared me his heir, I felt the air change, not with celebration, but with suspicion. His relatives were the first to bare their teeth. They had expected the empire to remain in their bloodline, in the hands of brothers, cousins, and sons who had waited greedily for his wealth. To them, I was a thief, an intruder, an outsider who had stolen what was rightfully theirs. They did not hide their contempt. Behind polished smiles and soft words, they lashed me with venom. "He is manipulating Kofi," they whispered to one another. "He is nothing but a peasant with a clever tongue." Their poison spread quickly. Rumors raced through markets and streets, twisting my name into something dirty. Some said I had bewitched him. Others swore I was a fraud who would ruin the village. Every kindness I once showed was rewritten as trickery. Every word I spoke recast as deceit. Even the villagers who once pitied me were divided. Some looked at me with awe, whispering that fate had finally lifted one of their own into greatness. But others narrowed their eyes, muttering that I had betrayed them by siding with a man they barely understood. The respect of half became the envy of the rest, and I walked each day on ground that could crumble beneath me at any moment. I remember one evening, walking through the village, when a group of children ran up to me. They no longer called me brother, as they once did. They asked instead, "Will you become like them now? Will you forget us, like the rich always do?" Their voices were innocent, but their words pierced me deeper than the cruelest rumor. I wanted to scream that I was still one of them, that I hadn't asked for this, that my heart still beat for the same struggles. But even I wasn't sure anymore. Gratitude and fear wrestled inside me, and I felt myself splitting in two. The villager I once was, and the heir I was now forced to become. Meanwhile, Kofi stood unshaken. He reminded me often, "Power reveals the true faces of those around you. Let their envy sharpen you, not break you." His words gave me strength, but they also made me wary. If this was only the beginning, what storms lay ahead? The hostility deepened. Some of his relatives stopped pretending. They confronted me openly, their voices dripping with scorn. "You are nothing but a child of dust," one hissed. "Do you think you can wear the crown of a king?" I tried to hold my ground, but their hatred burned hotter with every passing day. The village, once my safe place, now felt like a battlefield of whispers and stares. I slept restlessly, unsure whether the people who smiled at me by day were the same who cursed my name by night. And then came the moment that shattered my illusions. It was late. The moon was thin, its light pale and weak. I wandered near the edge of the compound, unable to sleep, my heart heavy with doubts. That's when I heard it. Low voices, hushed but sharp, cutting through the silence of the night. I crept closer, careful with every step. Behind the storage house in the shadowed corner, I saw them. Two of Kofi's closest kin, men who had smiled at him earlier that very day. Their whispers twisted with venom, their words chilling. "He has lost his mind," one said. "Choosing that boy over us? It is an insult we cannot forgive." The other spat into the dust. "The people will never follow him, but we cannot wait for them to turn. If we want what is ours, we must act soon, before the old man's heart gives out." My blood froze. Their plan was clear. Their envy had bloomed into betrayal. They weren't simply angry. They were plotting to strip him of everything, plotting to bring him down. My hands trembled as I pressed myself against the wall, my ears straining to catch every word. Their voices lowered further, but the intent in them was unmistakable. They would not rest until Kofi was destroyed, and if I stood in their way, I too would fall. My heart pounded so loudly, I feared they would hear it in the dark. Their whispers were no longer just rumors. They were weapons, sharpened in secret, ready to strike. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow, realizing the danger was no longer distant. It was here, inside the family itself. And that night, I understood. Betrayal was already in motion, and I had overheard its first steps. I realized my journey had come full circle. I had to protect him again. Once I gave him a blanket to shield him from the cold. Now I had to shield him from enemies who hid behind wealth, power, and lies. The stakes were higher, the dangers sharper, but the truth was clear. Destiny had tied my fate to his, and neither of us could survive without the other. The whispers of betrayal never truly faded. They grew into storms, swirling through his businesses, his alliances, his name. The very people who should have stood by him became shadows plotting his downfall. They knew they could not strike him openly, so they turned to poison more subtle than blades. Rumors, scandals, and sabotage. False documents surfaced overnight, accusing him of crimes he had never committed. His companies suddenly faced audits, inspections, and endless red tape, all engineered to bleed him dry. Newspapers, fed by envious hands, printed lies that painted him as corrupt, greedy, unworthy of trust. Even within the village where he had built every stone, doubts began to whisper. And there I was, his heir in name, his shield in spirit. My heart knew only one truth. If I did not fight for him, the world would devour him. In meetings with his business rivals, I spoke with a courage I did not feel, defending his name against their sharp tongues. In rooms filled with men in suits who sneered at my youth and simplicity, I stood straighter, my voice firm. Kofi Mensah is not a thief. He is the reason we have schools, roads, and clean water. His legacy is not corruption. It is compassion. My words wavered at first, but with each defense I grew stronger. In the village, I walked from home to home, reminding people of the wells he dug, the roofs he raised, the bread he placed on empty tables. Some listened with tears in their eyes, ashamed of their doubt. Others only scoffed, still poisoned by envy. But I did not stop. I could not. Every night, exhaustion crushed me, yet every dawn I rose again to fight his battles. I was no longer just his student or his heir. I was his soldier, his voice when others tried to silence him. But I was not perfect. My mistakes were many. In my eagerness to protect him, I sometimes spoke too harshly, alienating those who could have been allies. Once I trusted a man who claimed loyalty, but was secretly feeding our enemies. That betrayal nearly cost us a major contract, a wound that could have crippled everything he had built. I thought he would be furious. I thought he would strip me of the honor he had given. But instead, he placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Loyalty is not about never falling. It is about standing back up every time you do, and I trust you to rise." Those words burned into me, deeper than any rebuke. His faith in me, even when I faltered, became the strength that kept me upright. Still, the battles never ceased. Relatives plotted in secret. Villagers questioned openly. Rivals attacked from every direction. And through it all, Kofi stood tall. Yet I began to notice the toll it was taking. His shoulders sagged at times, his cough lingered longer, his steps slowed. He would wave away my concerns, insisting he was strong, but I saw the truth in his weary eyes. The empire rested on him, but the weight was too heavy. And though I fought beside him with all I had, I could not carry his years of struggle on my own. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, we sat together in silence. He gazed at the village, his face unreadable. "You remind me of myself," he said finally. "The fire, the stubbornness, the refusal to bow. But remember this, power is not about control. It is about protection. One day, you will understand." I wanted to tell him that day had already come, that I understood too well what it meant to protect him. But before I could speak, his hand trembled slightly, and he pressed it against his chest. The moment passed quickly, too quickly for me to act, but a seed of dread took root in my heart. Days turned into weeks, and I fought harder, louder, sharper, yet always with one eye on him, always afraid of the shadow I saw creeping closer. His enemies were many, but I began to fear the greatest enemy was not them. It was time. And then, it happened. One evening, as laughter filled the compound with visitors pretending to be friends, I noticed his face, pale, his hand clutching his chest. His voice faltered mid-sentence, and in the next breath, his body collapsed like a tree cut from its roots. Gasps filled the air. Cries broke the night, and in that instant, the empire lost its anchor. The weight he had carried for decades fell, straight onto me. The strongest man I had ever known lay weak in bed, yet his words were more powerful than ever. Machines beeped, doctors whispered, and the air smelled of medicine and fear, but his eyes still burned with fire. For the first time, I saw not the king, not the builder, not the legend, but the man, and it broke me. The night he collapsed still echoed in my chest like a nightmare I could not wake from. One moment he was towering, commanding a room full of men who envied him, and the next, he was on the floor, his breath shallow, his body trembling, his skin pale as ash. We rushed him to the hospital, but even the flashing lights of ambulances could not erase the terror in my heart. Now, as I sat by his bed, the steady rhythm of machines was the only reminder that he was still alive. Tubes ran from his arms, wires spread across his chest, and every rise and fall of his breath seemed like a fragile miracle. I held his hand, once so firm, now thin and trembling, and whispered prayers under my breath, prayers I wasn't even sure would reach heaven. For hours he remained silent, his eyes closed, his body resting as the doctors moved in and out of the room. And then, slowly, his eyes opened. Weak, yes, but not defeated. His gaze found mine, and with the faintest smile, he squeezed my hand. "My child," he whispered, his voice raspy yet strong enough to still command silence. "Wealth means nothing without people." Tears welled in my eyes. I wanted to tell him not to speak, to save his strength, but I knew better. These were not ordinary words. These were words carved from the depths of his soul, final lessons he had carried all his life, now passing them to me. He coughed lightly, then continued. "I built roads, schools, businesses. I built an empire. But what did it matter when I had no one to trust, no one to love? All my billions could not buy me one moment of compassion." His grip tightened on my hand, and I felt his weakness hide behind his determination. "That night," he said, his voice breaking, "when you gave me your blanket, that was worth more than all my billions." The tears I had held back spilled down my cheeks. I remembered the night clearly, the way I had simply acted on instinct, offering what little I had to a man I thought was lost. I never imagined that small act would be the very proof he sought, the seed of a destiny I could never have dreamed. He lifted his head slightly, his eyes blazing with the last sparks of fire that had once built a world. "Do not measure life by what you own," he whispered. "Measure it by who you lift, who you protect, who you love. Money can build walls, but compassion builds bridges, and bridges last." I sobbed quietly, nodding, unable to form words. His frail body looked nothing like the giant who once stood before black cars, yet in this moment, he was greater than ever. His power was no longer in his strength, it was in his truth. He smiled weakly. "Do not be afraid, my heir. The world will test you, break you, tempt you. But remember, the blanket was not just kindness. It was courage. Courage to give when you had little. Courage to love when others had forgotten how. That courage is what the world needs." I wanted to beg him not to leave me. I wanted to promise I would fight, though inside I trembled like a child lost in the dark. But he seemed to hear the words I couldn't say. He placed his other hand over mine, his touch warm despite the coldness of the room. "I entrust you with my dream," he said slowly. "Not just the businesses, not just the land, not just the wealth, but the dream. The dream that no child in this village should grow up hungry, that no one should be invisible, that compassion will outlive greed." My chest heaved as sobs escaped me. I pressed my forehead against his hand, feeling his fragile pulse beat against my skin. "I'm not ready," I whispered through tears. "I don't know if I can do it." He chuckled weakly, a sound so soft it was almost a breath. Neither was I. But destiny does not wait for readiness. It waits for courage. Those words cut through me like fire, searing into my soul. His eyes began to close, his breaths shallow again. I panicked, clutching his hand tighter. "Please," I cried. "Don't go yet. I still need you. We still need you." He opened his eyes one last time, and I saw peace in them. Peace I had never seen before. "Do not mourn me," he whispered. "Live me. In every act of kindness, in every battle for truth, I will not be gone. I will live through you." My tears fell freely, blurring my vision. He smiled faintly, his lips trembling, and then with one final breath he whispered, "The blanket was the beginning. You are the rest of the story." And then, silence. The machines beeped steadily, but my world fell silent. His hand, once warm, grew cold in mine. In that moment, grief tore through me like fire. But alongside it came a heavier burden, the weight of his dream. He did not just leave me with sorrow, he left me with destiny. And destiny is heavier than grief. I never imagined a single blanket could build a legacy. What began as a humble act of kindness became the fire that reshaped my entire destiny. With every thread, I carried his memory, his dream, and his unfinished fight for dignity. But as I rose to honor him, I discovered that legacies are not just inherited, they are tested, and mine was about to face the storm of truth. After his passing, silence covered me like a heavy shroud, but within that silence burned a purpose too loud to ignore. The blanket he left behind was more than cloth. It was a covenant, a reminder that his fight for dignity must continue through me. I returned to the village, not as a broken soul mourning him, but as a torchbearer determined to ignite change. Every school we rebuilt felt like a brick in his memory. Every classroom a tribute to the boy who once studied under a dim lantern. I walked into dusty fields where hopelessness had lived for generations, and I planted seeds of jobs, education, and new beginnings. Mothers who once wept over empty pots now held baskets of food because of the initiatives we launched. Fathers who once drowned in despair now carried pride as they worked in factories and farms we revived. The people began to call me a leader, but I never wore the title for power. I wore it for him, for them, for the dream stitched into that blanket. Each act of kindness became a ripple, touching lives far beyond what I had ever imagined. And yet, with every victory, whispers grew louder, rumors of those who envied the movement we built. I realized that legacies are fragile, not because of time, but because of those who seek to erase them. One night, as I stood in the community center, staring at the blanket displayed behind glass, I asked myself, was I living his legacy, or was I creating my own? The answer didn't come immediately, but in the laughter of children, in the proud songs of elders, and in the tears of those who had found hope again. His spirit was not just in the blanket anymore. It was in every life we touched. Yet deep down, I knew the greatest test of this legacy was yet to come. And that's how it began. Not just his story, but mine. A destiny born from one act of compassion, yet destined to be tested by fire. For every legacy shines brightest before the shadows arrive. And soon, I would face the darkness that threatened to tear everything apart. If this story touched your heart, don't just stop here. Be part of the journey. Hit the subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter of courage and compassion. Share this video with someone who believes in the power of kindness to change lives. And tell me in the comments, what does legacy mean to you? Your words might inspire the next story.